would like to acknowledge that the University of Calgary is on the traditional lands of the Niitsitapi Blackfoot Confederacy, which include Kainaiwa, Siksika, and Piikani, and the peoples of Treaty 7, including the Stoney Nakoda First Nations, Chiniki, Wesley, and Bearspaw, and the Tsuut'ina First Nations. In addition, the City of Calgary is homeland to Métis Nation Region 3.
Thank you so much for that land acknowledgement, Sandy. Okay, everyone, welcome back. It's good to connect again. This is our second to last workshop around the Indigenous guiding principles around curriculum development. So I'm very honored to be able to reconnect again this week. For those of you who are rejoining the group, welcome back, and for those of you who may be new, I hope you're able to get caught up, and hopefully when I do a little bit of a recap, you'll get a sense of where we've been and also where we're going. So really thinking a lot about, I've been thinking quite a bit about how do you embody some of the principles in a way where they're meaningful and they provide a point of really deep learning. I find even the English language sometimes to be very insufficient in capturing some of these, so the spirit behind the principles, and as I was reflecting even more on the notion of the learning spirit, and how curriculum is so connected to our students and what they experience, and as I was planning for this workshop, all of these things were going through my mind. And how do you move from an outcomes based to a process based? I'm involved in a SOTL research project with some colleagues, and we're really focusing on disrupting colonial thinking, in the disciplines, and how as instructors we often unconsciously are complicit in colonization in ways that perpetuate that split. We kind of split ourselves when we're in academic spaces where we're this expert, we're this knower. We're not drawing on our whole selves, and so it was very interesting. And I'm not going to start today off with the ramble, but I wanted to let you folks know that I struggle with these as well, and I think it is that struggle that has really motivated me to really sit with the elders and sit with community members, even my parents, and talk about some of these. How do you embody your learning? How do we live our learning in a way that's meaningful, in a way where we are transformed every day because of our knowledge, because of our relationship to our knowledge, and I'm really inspired by that. So in that, and I guess in the spirit of reciprocity, I'm very honored to be able to share with you some of the things that I've been really reflecting on, and no, it's not my calendar. Let me get this here going on. So let me just get organized here. Thank you, Ivy. Yeah, I'm glad we can kind of come together and dialogue about these things. So let me just get this is a very Let's just start here. Okay, so so for today, this afternoon, what I want to talk about is we'll start with where we were. So where we were last week, really looking at those ways of connecting and cultivating relational accountability in our curriculum development processes. We looked at the ethical space. We looked at some accountability approaches, and then how do we put our principle into action? How do we put this principle into action? From there, I'll talk about reciprocity, the nature of reciprocity from an Indigenous perspective, highlight some tensions and some implications for curriculum development, and how do we practice reciprocity in the institution. So and then putting those principles into action. So starting off with, I always like to just give a little bit of an overview of what those principles are. So the first, the beginning of the month, we looked at ways of being and that notion of transformation and renewal, understanding and identifying how our personal values and beliefs influence curriculum, where the starting point is self. Who am I? Where do I come from? What are my responsibilities as a learner first, always as a learner, and then as an educator? I think if we always position ourselves as a learner, that really cultivates that humility in learning. And then last week we looked at relational accountability and how are we accountable to our relationships in the curriculum development approaches that we take up. And this week we're going to look at ways of knowing, ways of doing and connecting, and looking at the principle of practicing reciprocity. And for those of you who, as I highlighted in our very first workshop, a lot of what inspired me is the Adapadope Indigenous strategy. So these cultural symbols that are in the presentation represent the Indigenous ways of being, Indigenous ways of knowing, Indigenous ways of doing and connecting, as parallel to some institutional processes as well. So we'll look at practicing reciprocity today, and then our final workshop will be around shared space, and really coming full circle to look at shared space, look at ways of knowing, ways of being and doing, and how do we validate the curriculum through a parallel process. And so that'll be for next week. So I'm just going to get started in looking at where we were. So really looked at that ways of connecting. So last week we covered that the principle of cultivating relational accountability in curriculum development approaches. I highlighted how Indigenous knowledge is local knowledge and generated through multiple embodied experiences in relation to people, places, lands, and other living entities, and how it's always best to begin connecting with the traditional guardians of the land. So start with the land that you are on. So let's look at where we are right now. What are the local First Nations? Who are they? What is the language? And what are some of the protocols that are distinct to the area that we now call Southern Alberta? What treaty area am I in, and so what are my responsibilities as a treaty person? Because we are all treaty people. So, and the notion that Indigenous curriculum is not developed in isolation from the community, from the land, and from the knowledge keepers. Shared space and ways of connecting, as highlighted in our strategy, emphasize the importance of relationship building, community engagement, and ethical spaces for dialogue. Relational accountability means being responsible to the Indigenous nations, communities, and individuals from which curricular concepts and knowledges may be derived from. Relational accountability occurs through connection, it occurs through engagement, it occurs through learning and through dialogue. Direct experiences in relationship to land, people, knowledges, and histories and languages inform curriculum. Critical self-reflection and collective dialogue on the principle of relational accountability can assist in identifying both possibilities for expanding relational networks and gaps and knowledge that require attention. We also looked at the ethical space. What is the ethical space and what are the implications for curriculum development? So to recap, I'm just going to give a recap. Willie Ermine refers to it as a theoretical space that opens up when two divergent thought systems meet. It's a space for dialogue to reveal assumptions and biases which might influence how we embody our knowledge in ways that may perpetuate colonial ideologies. Ethical space moves us beyond surface level approaches based on outward external awareness and allows us to see patterns of rupture in our relationships. A central question last week that emerged through our discussions and through the notion of accountability is, how do we transform our personal and professional practices to better reflect multiple ways of knowing and doing? A first step is accepting that transformation happens when we are out of our comfort zone. Discomfort means confronting and deconstructing how curriculum, consultation, and engagement are typically approached in the institution. Relational work is also a site of resistance and transformation. So ethical space allows us to talk about unsafe topics such as structural violence. And structural violence takes the form in unequal balance of power and resources. So in curriculum planning, it can go unchallenged and is often implicitly supported through the norms of the institution. Our current curriculum development processes do not meaningfully consider notions of Indigenous sovereignty. Thus, they risk perpetuating ignorance about treaties, self-determination, Indigenous languages, and Indigenous lifeways. Curriculum projects are often already envisioned, planning frameworks are set, and budgets are finalized before Indigenous people even come to the table. So box ticking becomes the norm when doing Indigenous engagement. So we looked at that. We also looked at the different accountability approaches, both from an Indigenous perspective and from an institutional perspective. And so I won't go too much in depth in that, but I think what's really important here is when considering principle to action, the relational orientation of an Indigenous paradigm really illuminates possibilities for expanding our connections. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. So I'm going to just go and I'd like to highlight our dialogue last week. And you know, last week we talked about some of the challenges that came up but also and I think just as importantly, we also talked about our possibilities as well. one of you had asked me if I would be able, if there was any publications I had that kind of delved or dived a little bit more into a relationality, accountability, and some of the concepts that I've introduced in the curriculum principles. So I do have some publications there with some of my colleagues that I've been working with. Geez, for almost 4 years now, we've been working at disrupting colonialism in our thinking. So some of the challenges that we talked about were curriculum, the current curriculum approaches and content, how they make students feel disconnected from each other, from their own selves, and from the land. An ongoing one was compensating elders and knowledge keepers. How do we do that? Current curriculum approaches and it's difficult to access budget where we're adequately providing honorariums and in a fair way. I mean that the elders and the knowledge keepers that we access, they have very specialized knowledge, and how are we able to honor that? And another challenge was that idea of shifting from outcomes to processes. So imagining process-based course outcomes, and the idea that faculty will be expected to assimilate into an Indigenous paradigm of curriculum development. And I kind of highlighted the impossibility of that if we bring it back to the paradigm and we really critically engage with the Indigenous paradigm, and especially notions of inclusivity, where our paradigm, the Indigenous paradigm, is really built around honoring differences and making space for those. And so the notion of assimilating into an Indigenous paradigm is kind of we really need to critically reflect on our frame of reference. Am I using these colonial binaries to understand what Gabrielle is talking about in these curriculum principles? I need to step back and sort of deconstruct my frame of reference, right? And where am I imposing colonial binaries on this on these some of the concepts, say. So, but really importantly as well is the notion of possibilities. And I like the comment where we'd like to reach a point where there are credit courses that teach history material, that teach geography material, that teach English materials, even languages, through Indigenous teaching. So actually reaching that point, what is it going to take to get us there, to get us to that point, right? What does process-based curriculum look like? So one of you folks had mentioned in the chat, going through the process could be an outcome in and of itself, and I think this is a really important one as well. And then building Indigenous principles into a forward design approach that sets more open-ended goals in collaboration with Indigenous community, faculty members, knowledge holders, elders, etc. The starting point is, and I think Jackie, you mentioned this in the chat, and I really I just want to highlight it here. So the starting point is the learner's experience and the learner's journey and what that looks like, instead of the starting point being where the learning ends up. So it's almost, and I find, and I'm just going to share this with you folks, is like there's almost like this real I'm just going to say it, like there's almost like this arrogance in our curriculum development processes that we know what the outcomes are going to be. You know, we know that this is what the learner is going to learn. I find that there really is this arrogance that we can actually know this, right? And so I like the idea of focusing on the process of learning, the journey. The outcomes will come, the outcomes will be the outcomes, right? But what is that learning journey for the instructor? What is that learning journey going to look like for the students? Well, we don't really know, right? But if we set up our curriculum where we're actually going through processes that we expect our students to go through, or at the program level that we expect our instructors to embody, then we need to be able to embody those processes too, right? Through the development. And it's not so lots of things to think about, right? And expanding another one was, this notion of expanding timelines. We need to be generous with taking the time to allow for this iterative relational process for developing curriculum. Oftentimes we are driven by the timelines of the institution, but it's going to take doing that reflective work, that iterative reflective work throughout our curriculum development process. That also takes time, but it also goes back to the tensions in the paradigms where Dr. Leroy Littlebear actually has a really good article where he talks about the limitations of time, right? And how, from an Indigenous perspective, time just is, it doesn't actually drive what we do. It just is. It's part of our existence. Time will pass. Nothing is permanent, and we all there's always changes, and we all change. And so I really like that idea of expanding our timelines to allow for that iterative process to occur. Yeah, Caitlin, I identified the difference between objectives and outcomes. Absolutely, and not to get into the weeds of it, but for sure they aren't always the same. And I do see how oftentimes they're used interchangeably. So yeah, that's a great point. So ways of knowing, doing, and connecting. The notion of practicing reciprocity. I'll just offer up some highlights here. So, Indigenous knowledge operates from the notion of balance and an assumption of a kind and abundant universe, and that the land offers enough for all life to thrive, but we must practice reciprocity in order for balance to be maintained. So along this same thinking, curriculum should benefit Indigenous peoples, and that benefit might be made transparent through community engagement and reciprocal knowledge exchanges. Curriculum development processes must follow appropriate Indigenous protocols to ensure that reciprocity is upheld. Knowledge is a sacred gift, so it is our responsibility for reciprocating this gift in appropriate ways. Indigenous elders see possibilities as opposed to problems, which can help us to see how possibilities for reciprocity are part of life, which in turn broadens a sense of responsibility. So I'm gonna shift a little bit, and I want to talk a little bit about what what makes a good curriculum and highlight the notion that curriculum is not one size fits all and is very context dependent, right? As I was preparing this, I went online imagining that I'm doing research on how to do curriculum development. And I thought, well, let me just start somewhere. I'm just gonna type in how to do curriculum development. And there were some lots of websites, lots of different websites that came up. Of course, there was some that talked about selling, there was a lot that we're talking about, selling how-to manuals on curriculum development. I found it very interesting, but I came across this one and I thought it was really interesting. So what makes a good curriculum? So what does a good curriculum do? So it keeps it both, and I've got the link there if anybody's interested. But anyways, this is more geared for K to 12, but I thought it's useful here nonetheless, because the principles are still relevant to higher education. So what does a good curriculum do? It both creates and reflects culture and identity. Many Indigenous scholars and educators, parents, and elders have talked about how the curriculum, the curriculum that's taught both in K to 12 and in higher education does not reflect Indigenous culture or identity. It normalizes Eurocentrism, thus reflecting societal values that advance Euro-settler culture and reinforces settler identity. And it normalizes whiteness, heteropatriarchy, and linguistic hegemony, and diversifies color, language as existing outside of the center of normalcy. And so it certainly does. It creates and reflects culture and identity. So absolutely it does, but what kind of culture and identity is it reflecting? A good curriculum keeps up with the changing world. Indigenous perspectives recognize that change is constant and inevitable. So the notion of constant flux highlights this. However, from a Western perspective, change is often conceptualized within the notion of progress and technological advancement, which is really a perspective that forces Indigenous cultures as relics of the past, and reinforces this idea that this notion that Indigenous knowledge holds little relevance to a changing world. It makes learning consistent. And while this highlights the importance of scaffolding learning by ensuring that students learn one concept before moving to the next, consistency is also approached through a linear model of learning, which can negate holism, whereby learning reproduces linearity and notions of progress. It creates opportunities for collaboration. And as the last workshop really highlighted, collaboration can be approached through half-hearted consultation. It also saves money. Good curriculum saves money. And we all need to save money. I think we can all appreciate that. But as an Indigenous person, I know that the institutions are not interested in investing in Indigenous peoples and knowledges. Saving money is often used as an excuse not to be reciprocal, because reciprocity is often understood as a monetary transaction. Aligns teaching and reinforces knowledge. Okay, what kind of knowledge is it reinforcing? So we need to be critical about these and okay, what kind of knowledge? It reinforces Western knowledge, provides measurable targets, which often reproduce the competitive nature of our education system. And students' sense of self-worth is tied up in grades, and faculty's sense of self-worth is tied up to measurable academic currency. So, you know, I think what I'm really advocating for here is to really take a critical look at how are we engaging with our curriculum development processes and some of the assumptions and the aims of our education system. You know, what are the assumptions curriculum makes, and what are the aims of education towards Indigenous people? So when looking at who benefits from curriculum, we really, again, need to look closely at the aims. This slide and some of the work that I drawn here is I did a community-led research project with the Pagan Board of Education, as well as some other Indigenous scholars, where we really looked closely at what are the aims of Indigenous or of Western education towards Indigenous people, so we can really understand how we can power up our Indigenous pedagogies through a treaty-based education model. So if anybody is interested in that research project, we've got the final report and I can share that. So while Western education has been championed by Eurocentric society as the solution to the current problems, an enduring pattern of marginalization exists where Indigenous students do less well than their non-Indigenous counterparts. So a central argument in this recent Indigenous community-led research project that myself and other Indigenous researchers did, that project brings to light a long-standing contradiction of mainstream education, in that it is aimed at assimilating Indigenous people. On the contrary, our extensive analysis of the history of Canadian education has demonstrated that education has been a functional tool for genocide by creating the conditions that have led to the continued advancement of Euro-settler peoples, whilst maintaining conditions that ensure the disintegration of an Indigenous identity via experiences of failure and loss of relevance within mainstream society. So this diagram that I have here, colonial structures and approaches to Indigenous education, represent 4 different understandings of Canadian state-led and state-endorsed Indigenous education approaches, all of which present a deficit approach to Indigenous cultures and worldviews, whilst placing Western knowledge and culture as the universal norm of development, progress, and civilization. The first 3 examples are conceptualized as degrees of assimilation. However, the intended policy was cultural genocide. The 4th example, education for healing of systemic trauma, that uses the traditional teachings of Indigenous cultures for recruitment and retention of disaffected youth, has been developed in parallel to approaches such as selective inclusion and the reconciliatory examples. So the findings do not suggest that any of these types of educational approaches are exclusive to any time period. So for instance, selective approaches that are based on deficit theorization of Indigenous peoples and their cultures are still very much a part of many, if not most, of today's educational programs, textbooks, as well as non-Indigenous teachers and learners' dispositions in mainstream education. So the point of this slide, and why I'm sharing it with you, is to demonstrate another perspective of how Western education has functioned in the destruction of Indigenous identity, culture, languages, and so forth. And I just want to give you a little bit of my, I want to share a story with you about when I was in, and I know we're talking about higher education, but I just want to share this with you. So I'll stop my sharing my screen for a minute and share with you an experience I had. So when I went back to high school, I had to take a year off of high school. Well, I repeated grade 9, and then I took a year off of high school because I had my daughter Maria. So I was 16 years old when I had Maria, and so I guess you could say I was very teenage pregnancy statistic, and that was the norm, sort of the expectations of society that I would be. I just fell right into it. You could say I fell right into that expectation. And so when I went back to, or when I started high school, by that time Maria was a little bit older. She was still a baby though, so I had a baby, and I was 18 and starting grade 10 at Catholic Central in Lethbridge, and that was the first time I had ever gone to school off of the reserve. And I remember I was in my career and life management course in grade 10. And the instructor, my teacher, was talking about teenage pregnancy, and was talking, and I don't know if it was really a part of our curriculum. In fact, I can't even really remember what the career and life management curriculum, what we were learning. I can't really remember anything in what I learned in high school. Not really anything useful, like how to do my taxes. But yeah, I remember we got on the topic of teenage pregnancy, specifically Indigenous people, and I remember my teacher talked about how teenage Indigenous girls are always having babies, and that the best thing that Canadian society could do is sterilize Indigenous girls right from the time they're sexually active to, that's what, because we end up as on welfare, and we end up on leaving our kids, and we don't know how to look after our kids, and yeah, and so I remember sitting there and wondering what this had to do with career and life management, and wondering, like, and I was the only Indian Native kid in there. While I was a young woman by then and a mother, and I remember, it's hard to describe, like the experience was very painful, and I walked out of there, and never to return to that class again. But I got into a lot of trouble by my TA, who was a priest, and I was angry, and I said, I don't know what we're supposed to be learning in that class. I haven't learned anything from her except that me and my baby don't matter. And that's all I've learned. And it was such a experience that to this day, I still look back on it, and I think about the idea of an irrelevant curriculum, and how many young people how many young Indigenous people are experiencing exactly what I did. And maybe there might be people in our Zoom room right now who think, wow, that's not, that rarely happens. But I can tell you it happens a lot, and in many different contexts. It happens in K-12 education. It happens in higher education. And so curriculum does, the way we're teaching it, so the process matters is what I mean. When we're doing curriculum development, what kind of energy are we putting into that curriculum? Like, that matters. Like, are we developing it when we're pissed off? Or, who is at the receiving end is human beings who have feelings and who have life and all of that. So it matters, and I always say, for Indigenous people, education can be a source of healing. I think not even just for Indigenous people, all of us. Education can be a source of healing, or it can destroy us, like literally destroy us. And curriculum development, I don't think has been given enough attention in terms of its role, because it's not neutral. And I think what we're exploring here is an opportunity, and opportunities for imagining other possibilities where we're compassionate in our curriculum, where we're relationally accountable, where we're walking in there knowing what kind of assumptions we have, knowing knowing our relationship to power, having a better understanding of our relationship to our own knowledge. And so, I guess my point is, it really is, that's how much it matters, and so, yeah, I wanted to share that story with you, because it has lived with me for so many years, and I remember it just like yesterday. So what are those aims of education towards Indigenous people? Really looking at that in a very critical way, because as an Indigenous person who's gone through Western education from K-12 right to a terminal degree, I can tell you right now that I have fought tooth and nail to learn who I am as an Indigenous woman. And it hasn't been through Western curriculum that I've done that. In fact, Western curriculum has sent me a message that I don't matter, that I should be white, that my language doesn't matter, my people don't matter, my histories don't matter. And it's taken me years to undo that learning. So yeah, I wanted to share that with you. So let's take a moment now. I know I've really been thinking about how I can build in some more dialogue in terms of these workshops. And so I wanted for us to kind of take a step back and have a little bit of a group dialogue and around these questions. How do Indigenous people benefit from curriculum? And to what extent can higher education curriculum interrupt the structural and cultural reproduction of social inequality? So 2 big questions. And really the purpose of these questions is to help us gain some holistic clarity around the aims and purposes of education. So yeah, I'm just going to kind of stop there. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen, and let's have a little bit of dialogue. If you're comfortable putting your answer in the chat, please do so. So I'll just put, so how do Indigenous people benefit from curriculum? Benefit from curriculum. And then the second one was, how can curriculum, and to what extent can curriculum interrupt structural and social inequality? So sort of these two questions. And yeah, so, and thank you very much for it's never easy for me to talk about those experiences, and I have many more, but that's the one that stands out to me the most. I like this by Crystal. It shouldn't be so challenging to navigate. Absolutely. It should help us grow and make a better world. Absolutely. So yeah, just if anybody wants to unmute their microphone, or put your comments in the chat, or please feel free to do so. Mandy.
Hi, thank you so much for this wonderful workshop. I'm so happy I was able to make it today. I was typing in the chat, but I had too much to say, so it's just easier to talk. In terms of curriculum development, I'm a pretty junior scholar, but I learned from a really amazing educator throughout my PhD, who I was a teaching assistant for. And what I think I saw from her that I really felt was important was twofold. On one hand, for non-Indigenous students, challenging their misconceptions and beliefs and doing education that they didn't have otherwise. For example, like a lot of our students were third-year university students and didn't know about residential schools, for example. And so doing a bit of a history lesson about the social inequality, the process of colonization. But secondly, the inclusion of Indigenous scholars in our curriculum, and speak to the experiences of the Indigenous students in the classroom as well, which I think it's sometimes a difficult balance to because they already have this knowledge and come in from very different place. But that's something I would really love to chat more about either today or in the future, is how to balance for those who are just coming to this material, and then also those who already come with that knowledge, primarily Indigenous students who may not necessarily need the same backgrounder, but that's kind of what I've learned through my experience watching somebody I really respect as an educator.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mandy. And I think that is, I don't think you're alone in terms of that question, and grappling with it, finding that balance, and how if I can go back to the last our last workshop, when I introduced that notion of fatigue on the part of Indigenous scholars, where we're asked, and it's great that, like, I get excited that people want to learn and want to engage, but the thing is oftentimes it can feel very extractive, and how do we move beyond acknowledging historical wrongs to actually embodying healing? And that's where we and healing is never a one size fits all, because we all I think we have all internalized colonization to some degree or another, right? And so I always talk about, and I do this with my students too when I'm teaching, and that's why I just love my teaching, my classroom teaching is where I am healing with students as well, where I'm learning with students, where I'm learning along. And especially when I teach my international Indigenous studies course, I tell you that is probably the most challenging class to teach, because I am not, I'm not, I'm expected to teach about lands and peoples that I've never met, that I've never been to. And I feel like a lot of times it's like, here, Gabe, here's your course. You're going to teach about other brown people, and you're expected to do it effectively because you're brown too, and you're Indigenous, and so you can do this, right? But I don't know about the Maori experience. I don't know what it's like to be hunted the way the Indigenous people in what is now known as Australia, to be physically hunted as if in that way. I don't know. And so the first thing I do when I'm with my students is I say just that. I'm very transparent, and I say, this is my challenge in teaching this class, but what I will commit to is learning alongside you. And I've prepared some material, prepared some curriculum that we're going to engage with together, and we're going to go on this learning journey together, because I don't know. Right. And so that is, I think, that's been very powerful for me, so thank you, Mandy, for that. And yeah, Sanabar, as educators, we can acknowledge the historical wrongs in Canada and hopefully provide a safe space through our curriculum development in our individual classes. Absolutely. And starting from that place of acknowledgement, I think, and going through processes, and that even acknowledging and then embodying that acknowledgement, right? So how do we do that through this process-based a development, right? Sarah, 100%. I would love to explore this question, Mandy. Ivy, regarding the second question, I'm wondering about collaboratively creating learning outcomes with students. I love that idea. Absolutely. At the start of a course, rather than students arriving at course outcomes that are already set. This has implications in terms of scaffolding learning in a program, but the process of collaboratively creating outcomes could include a discussion about what people already know, understand, or can do, and where they will be going after the course. I love that. Yeah, process-based development, good. So yeah, those are some really good reflections. Thank you, folks, for offering those up in the chat. Yeah, any more reflections or comments on those questions? Matthew.
Hi. Thanks so much for this another great presentation. I was just thinking, I know that, as PhD students and as researchers, we always have to try to figure out ways in which we can convey the importance of what we're doing to the rest of the world. And so it ends up, so I apologize in advance because some of the things I'm saying is part of that sales thing. So, being a PhD in adult learning, the way I introduce my my topic is to say that adult learning is really the 0 point of academia. All the people there in academia are adults, and they're all there to research, to learn, whether it's quantum physics and or fine arts, and so it's really a transdisciplinary phenomenon. My point getting to this is that the benefit of curriculum development really holds in the education, I believe, in the education center, because one of the comments, and I'd be curious if you how you feel about this, because one of the comments that I have about adult learning is to say, well, if we in the adult learning field can't get it right, how can we expect anyone else to get it right? So we've got to get it right first. And so I think it invites a very open opportunity and responsibility for the education faculty in particular to be open to alternative, not to say alternative, but alternative with respect to the hegemonic and conventional ways of doing things, but to explore those more vigorously. And I think that can become a real entry point into bringing in the Indigenous wisdom and values and perspectives into curriculum development. And I see that as being a local benefit to the Indigenous community. But I find it local, and I find it to be, and I think that the key word is that it's the responsibility of the education faculty to really explore that. Because if the education faculty can't get it right, how can you expect anyone else to? And maybe that's the wrong perspective that I have, but I just feel that that's the ethical principle that is sort of the pivot point, I think. And with respect to the rest of society, I see that as if we in the education faculty can get it right, and based on the modeling and examples, then it can then diffuse, it can then diffuse to the rest of society. It can become that wedge into the rest of society. But I think that the key point and the key focus is the education faculty. But I am biased in that regard, because that's what my PhD is banking on. So, but I'd love to get your perspective on that and how you feel.
Well, Matthew, thank you for that. And my PhD is also in adult learning. So, so I think a lot of my a lot of the concepts that I explore, and the way I explore them is I find some parallels in terms of the theories behind adult learning, especially the dignity for prior knowledge, like having that dignity for learners' prior knowledge. And that for me is really inspiring. And I think that is my signpost in what I'm doing is dignity, is dignity for how am I creating learning spaces that maintain that dignity, even right at the curriculum development level. So it's not even just a Sanabar. I see you're talking about accounting, and it's not so much content driven. Indigenous pedagogies, Indigenous approaches to curriculum development are not disciplinary or context driven. They really are a way of being in relationship with self, with power structures, with others, and with land, and with the natural environment. So yeah, I wanted to say that. I saw somebody else's hand up. Alicia, was it you? I think I saw your hand up. Yeah, please.
Yes, thank you, Gabriel. Well, I am not a PhD scholar. I am more in the pragmatic or practical aspect of the education profession as an instructional designer and as a teacher. And one of the things that for me have been difficult to reconcile throughout these lectures that you are giving is the operationalization of all this. I see it as a big strategy, as things that we would like to see set in place, but how can we make that happen, considering, as you mentioned, that our structures and our education model is based on colonial and industrial views, where you have the economies of scale, the democratization of education. So there are some things, for example, that for me make an intersection with the notion of, for example, a process base. Well, for me, that talks about the constructivism idea, that you will learn at your own pace, you will generate your knowledge, you co-design your knowledge with your teacher, but in order for this to happen, as you mentioned, is not time bound. So I am not constrained to a semester. I am not constrained to have to attend to 120 students, but I am working with 5, 3, or maybe just with 1. So those are the things that for me are the challenge. How can we set up the environment or the strategies or processes to being able to incorporate these notions? And for me, as an immigrant, my original country is Mexico, so we also were colonized in a very different way of 500 years ago. So our vision also is very different from the way education is perceived in North America. So having all these points, I don't know if there are, and as you talk about a parallel path, well, if we do a parallel path, how are we going to be able to co-create if each is in kind of their own lane? Or maybe I'm misinterpreting this. So this is where I am having my brain spinning.
Thank you for that, Alicia. And those are incredibly valid tensions that I think need to be at the forefront, and I think they're at the forefront of everyone's minds who are doing the academic work, who are doing that there's the complete disconnect between Western and Indigenous relationality. Even with when you mentioned, you're using okay, we're talking about process based, and then immediately we go back to our frames that make sense to us, right? And constructivism. And I've cautioned before that we need to understand Indigenous ways of knowing in as distinct from we it's good to there's parallels, there's intersecting points, absolutely, but how do we start understanding Indigenous ways of knowing as distinct, and not simply something that we can use interchangeably with Western theory, right? And so what I'm doing, the purpose of these principles is certainly not a how to overthrow the colonial system, because right now the system is it holds so much power, but the power of the system rests in its ability to disempower us as individuals, as if we can't make changes in our corner of the world. And that's why the principles have that starting point with self. So going through that struggle of sense making, of bringing it back to your home country, what are the laws of the land in Central America? What did the teachings of the land look like prior to colonization? That's how far we have to go back. And absolutely, it's a different context here, and especially in here in Southern Alberta, what is now known as Southern Alberta, we're talking about knowledge, Indigenous knowledge that is alive, very much alive in the minds of Indigenous people. We still speak, there's still fluent language speakers. And so, the context is very different for sure. But if we go back to that starting point of, I'm starting with myself. This is, where I'm engaging with my knowledge. It sounds like you're doing that, absolutely. And I think we all do that. But how do we reframe that and really start deconstructing that frame of reference? And how are we reframing what the purpose of education is? How are we reframing what it means to do instructional design, for example, to create those alternate, and I think it's fair, Matthew, to say, because if we're thinking about dominance, right, this is the dominant way, we often think that this is an alternative way of doing things, right? But for Indigenous people, this is the way. Like what I'm talking about here is the way we do things, which is why, and I can't remember if I said it in the last, in our last session, where I said, you're not gonna meet an Indigenous elder who is going to need cultural competency training, because they can work with everyone. They can identify and build relationships beyond linguistic boundaries, beyond conceptual boundaries. Now I'm thinking about myself here in the institution. Now I am able to interface between two paradigms. I think in some days it seems easier than others, and other days it's very difficult. But I think we all experience that kind of disconnection from this conceptual landscape of academia, where we know that we're not bringing our whole self into it. So it's my point is there are not easy answers. This isn't a how-to manual, but there's launching points that are going to get us to, or hopefully gently push us into another way of understanding the purpose of knowledge, right? And what could it mean to participate in a world of relationships where our accountability is tenfold, so anyhow, just some thoughts there. But thank you very much for that, Alicia. And I know I probably don't have I don't have all of the answers, of course, and nor do I pretend to, but I hope at least that gives us some other points of reflection. So I'm gonna move on, because I have a few slides that I want to get to as well. So what does reciprocity in curriculum development look like? What could it look like? And I've said before that curriculum development is not a one-size-fits-all, right? But whatever approach you choose to take, being critically aware of how Indigenous people have been left out of planning is a first step to embodying reciprocity. And so I've just got some examples here of what reciprocity looks like in curriculum development. So going from an international perspective, specifically South Africa, Naidoo and colleagues conceptualize curriculum development in the context of epistemic reciprocity, which is a term used to refer to curriculum development that engages explicitly with multiple knowledges, bringing them into dialogue with each other. I think there's some really critical and important work that's coming out of South Africa in terms of SODL and the notion of curriculum justice. And epistemic reciprocity has been introduced to address the lack of academic achievement of students from non-traditional backgrounds. Academic developers and policymakers in South Africa often use the term epistemological access to describe how students' prior knowledge and experience are not recognized in higher education. This focus on epistemological access or lack thereof has emphasized mainly a deficit or underpreparedness of the student rather than the inadequacy and inappropriateness of the curriculum to meet the student's needs. And I think this holds significant parallels in Canada, where Indigenous cultural deficit is used to explain the education gap rather than an irrelevant curriculum. Another example is found in the 4 R's of Indigenous education, which are respect, relevance, reciprocity, and responsibility. Reciprocity means that our curriculum development approaches do not simply appropriate Indigenous knowledge, but that it also gives back. So, for example, land-based learning. What are we giving back to the land? That's something. So we're taking our students out on the land. What are we giving back to the land? How is the land also benefiting from our presence? Are we offering? Are we giving an offering? Things like that. Indigenous educator Verna Kirkness says that American Indian or First Nations or Native people have been historically underrepresented in the ranks of college and university graduates in Canada and in the United States. From an institutional perspective, the problem has been typically defined in terms of low achievement, high attrition, poor retention, weak persistence, etc., thus placing the onus for adjustment on the student. From the perspective of the Indigenous student, however, that problem is often cast in more human terms, with an emphasis on the need for a higher education system that respects them for who they are, that is relevant to their view of the world, that offers reciprocity in their relationships with others, and that helps them exercise responsibility on their own lives. Reciprocity is about building trust through co-creating reciprocal theoretical frameworks with Indigenous people. Bishop and colleagues assert that for tens of thousands of years, Indigenous communities have had highly effective teaching and learning practices in place, which sustained human and non-human communities. However, this has been severely impacted with the imposition of Western schooling, which has been around for little more than a few hundred years in this region, longer in Eastern Eastern regions, of course, and much longer with our South and Central American relatives. So what could a reciprocal theoretical framework look like? So for educators and curriculum developers, this is about cultivating humility in what is known and yet to be known. For the Indigenous community, reciprocity allows for a shifting in decision-making power, which enables us to be self-determining in advancing Indigenous knowledge. For students, reciprocity is about challenging dominant knowledge hierarchies, so reinforcing the notion that their knowledge matters as well. So I want to talk a little bit about responsibility, because this is directly connected as well to being reciprocal. So being reciprocal in your curriculum development approaches means being responsible in the planning process, careful and critical self-reflection, relationship building, and doing the hard work of unlearning the colonial narrative in order to co-create a more balanced and realistic understanding of nation building is really that's responsibility in curriculum development. So learning and exploring the other side of Canadian history. So learning about the history of the Indian residential school, for example, so that you're responsible for learning with students about the legislation and policies leading up to the Indian residential schools, which laid the blueprint for structured community violence. So the legacy of Indian residential schools begins with the Royal Proclamation, which sought to separate the First Nations from their responsibilities to the land. And labels such as heathen and savage became the defining qualities for First Nations. Then the Indian Act of 1867 sought the ideological and spiritual destruction of Indigenous identities by severing the connections between land and spirit, the collective consciousness of Indigenous peoples. And this was a deliberate fracture orchestrated through the education system, which was designed to instill notions of inferiority. So the goal of genocide with regard to Indigenous people is or was the destruction of our identity. Legal scholar Kurt Mundorf states that genocide is any deliberate act committed with the intention of destroying the language, religion, or culture of a group, such as, for example, prohibiting the use of the group's language or its schools or places of worship. According to Lemkin, the destruction of a nation, therefore, results in the loss of its future contribution to the world. The Indian residential schools were deliberately managed, organized, and delivered to destroy Indigenous nations through the creation of a traumatic learning environment. So any safety, familiar, and assuring aspects for child development were removed. The security of spiritual practices, supporting an infinite kinship system, and inclusive nurturing spiritual practices were prohibited. The separation of the children from home to a sterile environment was a strategic effort in severing the natural process for lifelong learning and destroyed the hope for the continuity of First Nations to continue to exist as nations. So today, this history is still being denied. And I think as long as this denial exists, the Canadian nation cannot heal. Matthew, I think I saw your hand go up. Please, if you'd like to unmute.
No, sorry, I just forgot to put my hand down. So
okay. All right. Okay. So another responsibility is learning about the treaties from what are treaties from an Indigenous perspective. I think the point of this is, we've learned about the colonial perspective. We've learned about the Western perspective. And I think, Alicia, your comment demonstrated how we've internalized them to such a degree that it's hard to imagine another way, right? So these learning opportunities, learning with students, setting up our curriculum in ways where we can learn about treaties as sacred alliances that are situated within the context of First Nations spiritual traditions. And so treaties establish spiritual guidance and connections to land. And treaties are the basis for maintaining Indigenous culture, languages, practices, and identities. So treaties form the basis of Indigenous citizenship, education, identity, and cultural continuity. And they're also grounded in the intent and spirit of reciprocity. So this idea that there's this give and take, right, between between the Canadian state and Indigenous people. But the minute anything is honored in the treaties, there's this deep resentment on the part of Canadian society, members of Canadian society, where Indigenous people are looked on as getting free stuff, and nobody knows what the Indian fund is like. Nobody has an understanding that these lands existed before Treaty 7. What is Treaty 7? What does it mean to be a treaty person? So that's part of that responsibility. And then we're learning about protocols, the purpose of protocols, the contexts, and their role in reciprocity, because protocols bring balance to our life and our relationships. Protocols are grounded in reciprocity and reinforce generosity. We are a gifting culture based in generosity. Reciprocity is a way of being for us and is our way of life as Indigenous people. So reciprocity is more than a transaction or anything like that. It really is a way of being. It's at the heart of our ceremonies. It's who we are. I remember I asked my dad, what does reciprocity mean for us? He kind of looked at me quizzically and said, what do you mean? That's who we are. That's who we are. And so that made sense to me. So there's some guiding questions here, and this is just taken right from the curriculum to curriculum principles. I think they're good ones though, because reciprocity in curriculum development means that developing curriculum is a two-way process, which sets the foundation for teaching and learning as a two-way process as well. There is a give and take between the institution and Indigenous communities, as opposed to appropriating from Indigenous communities. Reciprocity is achieved when the curriculum developers or individual faculty, at whatever level the development is happening, make an effort to understand and build upon the perspectives and pedagogies of Indigenous cultures. At the classroom level, and as Verna Kirkness points out, reciprocity involves building upon the cultural background of Indigenous students so instructors can meaningfully connect with who Indigenous students are. And the Indigenous students are able to gain better access to the inner workings of the institution if they can see themselves reflected in what is being taught. So this table is taken from the curriculum principles, but I think they're useful because they offer a scenario. Here's a curriculum project involved consultation and input from several Indigenous people. How do we move forward? How do we start giving back to community? So this isn't the only way, of course, but I think it offers launching points and where you can begin to start thinking about this in really critical ways. For example, can you offer to do a presentation for an Indigenous colleague around a topic related to your curriculum project? Would inviting Indigenous community members to an event or on-campus feast be a feasible option for giving back to the community? Can you develop a community engaged learning component as part of your curriculum project to ensure opportunities for reciprocity? So yeah, that's what I've got prepared. And what I think is really, if anybody has any additional comments or questions, I know we've only got like four or 5 minutes, but I'll just stop sharing there. Ivy, when we talk about process-based curricula, we are talking about redirecting the focus on the ethical processes used to develop that curricula, or using process steps as course program level learning outcomes, or both, to build students' abilities to perform a process. Thank you for that. Jill, I'm just so appreciative of your generous sharing. Absolutely. Thank you so much. And Sanabar, as I said, oftentimes what really stops people from engaging in Indigenous ways of knowing in their curriculum development is this idea that accounting doesn't, or science, or any that Indigenous people didn't have a system for understanding numbers, or that we didn't have a science system. We always default to that Western knowledge system, right? Because it's so embedded in our thinking. So transformation happens when we start imagining other ways and start engaging in other ways. And that is really, that starting point, as I said, is really at that critical self-reflection, and where does my knowledge come from? What is my relationship to power, and what is valid knowledge? What do I think is valid knowledge, and why do I think that? So yeah, so thank you for that. And thank you everyone for engaging this afternoon in these in the dialogue and in this learning. It's been really good to connect. So I'll just stop there. I don't think it's 1:28. I don't think we have time for questions, but thank you. And I really look forward to seeing you again next week. So be well, everyone.